Polanski went to jail for 42 days.
He was an acclaimed film director. She, a 13-year-old girl.
By Roman Polanski.
It was 1977. He took advantage of me and made me have sex with him.
Case against the famous director remains open and unresolved.
Welcome, everyone, to Unshut Cases. I'm Dan Taft, the host of Unshut Cases. On today's episode, we have with us an incredible attorney out of Oakland, California, Micha Star Liberty of Liberty Law, employment, sexual abuse and assault, civil rights attorney. Micha, thank you so much for joining us on today's episode.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and we are diving into an interesting high-profile historical case here, the Roman Polanski sexual abuse case, 1977 LA, a case that shook Hollywood. For anyone that's not aware, Roman Polanski was a huge film director of the time, Chinatown, Rosemary's Baby. He was, as A-list as it comes. He was charged with 6 offenses against Samantha Gailey, who was a 13-year-old girl, unlawful sexual intercourse with a minor by use of drugs, perversion, sodomy, lewd and lascivious act upon a child under the age of 14, and furnishing a controlled substance to a minor. To give a little bit of background here on the actual case, Polanski allegedly asked Gailey's mother, who was a television actress and model, if he could photograph her as part of his work for the French edition of Vogue. Her mother allowed a private photo shoot in which she posed topless. At Polanski's request, she then reluctantly agreed to another shoot. Took place at the home of Jack Nicholson and Angelica Houston. And Jack Nicholson was, of course, in Star of Chinatown. Houston returned while Polanski and Gailey were there, became suspicious of what was going on behind the closed bedroom door, began banging on it, but left when Polanski insisted they were finishing up the photo shoot. Polanski provided champagne that they shared as well as part of a quaalude. Despite her protests, performed oral sex on her, penetrated her both vaginally and anally. It's very disturbing details here. Each time after being told no, being asked to stop. Polanski's parole officer excused his behavior due to his creative genius and being an immigrant from a land with different morals. He also placed some of the blame on the victim and her mother. Litigation. So Gailey's attorney arranged a plea bargain that Polanski accepted. The 5 initial charges were dismissed and Polanski pleaded guilty to only the lesser charge of engaging in unlawful sexual intercourse with a minor. The court ordered Polanski to report to a state prison for a 90-day psychiatric evaluation, but granted a stay to allow him to complete his current project. After being photographed with the young girls, he was ordered to return to California, reported to Chino State Prison, was released after 42 days. His lawyers expected that Polanski would receive probation. At the subsequent sentencing hearing, with the probation officer examining psychiatrist and the victim all recommending against prison time. The judge suggested to them that he would send the director to prison and order him deported. Polanski became a fugitive from justice, fled the United States famously, went to England before landing in France, where he held citizenship. He was of French and Polish descent. France can refuse to extradite its own citizens, and an extradition request later filed by U.S. officials was actually denied. More recently, just to kind of bring everyone up to speed, in 2009, Polanski was detained by Swiss police at Zurich airport while trying to enter Switzerland in relation to his outstanding 1978 U.S. arrest warrant. However, the Swiss court rejected the U.S. extradition request and released Polanski from custody. Over 160 film directors, actors, screenwriters, and producers signed a petition which urged Polanski's release. Emma Thompson and Natalie Portman later removed their names from the petition and expressed regret over signing it. And then the exposure of Harvey Weinstein as a predator 2017 brought renewed attention to Polanski's history of child rape. So this is obviously a horrible, horrible case. I know that was a lot there, Micha, but you are the expert in everything sexual abuse, assault, all these things for these victims. Can you kind of just give us your expert opinion? Gailey's lawyers reportedly offered Polanski the plea bargain to protect their client. What would have been the logic behind something like that, just offering a plea bargain in this case?
To have some closure, to have some accountability for the young victim. When we look at it by today's standards in terms of the civil litigation that goes on now over cases like this and the types of sentences that we see, what was offered was a pittance. I mean, it was nothing. And the reason why, my understanding is from inside, a little bit of inside information, is the reason why he left the country was because although there were rumors that the judge was inclined to, at his sentencing hearing, decide that his time served counted, so the 42 days that he had spent in jail would have been a wash at that point. There was starting to be some societal pressure. And there was a concern that the judge was going to back away from his time served sentence and actually have him do some real time, which is appropriate and is what should have happened.
Yeah, it really is shocking, honestly. And again, this was before, my time, certainly the original charges and everything that happened here. But it just feels like one of those things that if it happened now, I can't imagine what happened then happening, but maybe I'm wrong and something, I don't know, but it just seems so over the top that it's amazing that he kind of got away with this.
Absolutely. And what's interesting to me is to do exactly what you're suggesting, compare the two timeframes. Sadly, in the 70s, there was a lot of reports of famous people. If you look at all the musicians in the 60s and 70s, quote unquote, dating groupies, they were all raping children.
Yeah.
That is what was happening. But societally, we looked at things a little bit differently, or I should say the power structure looked at things a little bit differently. But a lot of the arguments that Polanski and his PR folks used are the same kind of arguments that we see today. It was consensual, which legally is a complete fallacy. It's not consensual when you have sex with a child under the age of 14, and Samantha was 13 at the time. There's also allegations that, she was engaged in drug use and, the victim blaming stuff that we always see. But we didn't see civil litigation back in the day. Right. And so that's the real difference. All of these types of cases were viewed through a lens of the criminal justice process. And because of the fame and notoriety and wealth that these perpetrators had, including Polanski, and the resources he had to be able to flee the country unscathed, essentially, they've just been able to really escape justice and escape accountability. And when you look at the famous people who have come forward and supported him, Harvey Weinstein, Johnny Depp, David Lynch, Adrian Brody, there's so many people who have suggested those back in the day and even now that we should, as a society, be viewing this in a lens where we can separate the talent, the artistry from the person. And that's the last thing we should be doing. It is the absolute last thing we should be doing.
Yeah, it is another shocking thing that you bring up, that I think it was 160, I believe was the number that I saw there. Yeah, directors, actors, screenwriters, producers. And some of them, the ones you mentioned, A-list people, it's like, not to say that if they weren't A-list people, but they have so much visibility and so much sort of, you're like, how are you sort of co-signing this? It's just out of this world to me.
Well, but look at who some of the more famous ones are.
Yep.
Harvey Weinstein has his own problems. Woody Allen has his own allegations. Yep. Johnny Depp has his own allegations. David Lynch. I want to be careful about what I call them, but these are folks who might be more sympathetic because they too have been accused of these horrible, horrible things.
Right. Harvey Weinstein, certainly.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and the others. And there have been rumors. I have tried to track down, the rumors about a bet between Polanski, Jack Nicholson, and David Crosby, because those have been swimming around LA for decades. And really, there's not any actual data on it. So perhaps they're just rumors. It was a different time. And, unfortunately, we didn't, as a society, do our best at protecting these girls. But Samantha wasn't the only one with Polanski. So there are others who came forward. There was Charlotte, who was alleged she was sexually assaulted by Polanski in 1983. Robin M. claimed she was sexually assaulted by him in 1973.
This is a photo of Robin when she was in high school and was approximately 16 years old.
Renata in 72. And then there was just recently here in California a lawsuit filed by someone who claims that she was a teenager at the time. And because we had a window to file old claims, a lawsuit was filed. And, I'm sure he won't appear. Maybe he'll have counsel. I don't know. But that case has been set for trial in 2025. So, when we look at the patterns that we see, the MOs, it's the same, right? He is engaging in criminal acts and perpetrating sexual violence on children over a period of about a decade.
It's abhorrent. I mean, he should be, there's no question this guy should have been in prison ideally before any of this happened. But certainly since it's been 47 years. Can you actually speak to, because you raised something interesting there that I also want to touch on. I know that in law, in a lot of areas, there's statute of limitations. If you bring something up after whatever number of years it is in certain instances, you cannot do it anymore. But I suppose because you're saying a new thing just came up recently and is set for 2025, here that does not apply.
In Samantha's case, it could have. She could have taken advantage of one of the several look back windows that we have seen here in California, but obviously didn't. And she could have brought a lawsuit. Those windows have closed for the most part. There's a lot of different ways to interpret the statutes as they stand, and they're constantly changing. Here in California, we've actually just finally said no more statutes of limitations going forward for sexual abuse, because it takes so long for survivors to even acknowledge to themselves what happened, to name it, and then to be able to kind of steel themselves for the battle that is civil litigation when they had these kinds of horrible experiences as children.
President Biden signed the Eliminating Limits to Justice for Child Sex Abuse Victims Act. It states there is no time limit for filing a civil claim in federal court, and now several states have followed suit.
So at least as a society and legislatively, we're moving forward in appropriate ways. But there are a lot of women and girls and boys who lost their right to sue civilly because they didn't bring a claim within the time frame necessary.
In this case, the Samantha Gailey case with Roman Polanski, how did the pictures taken of him at Oktoberfest with his arms around young girls affect this particular case? Because I know that was a whole thing where, that came up, I think, in evidence or whatever. I guess they were presenting that as part of this whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, again, it just shows a proclivity, a draw, a pattern of criminal conduct. And there have been other attempts. So, like, for example, you may have touched on this. There was an attempt. He was arrested in Switzerland, I think, in 2009. And then there was another attempt to extradite him. That fight took a while because the United States was trying to enforce a very, very old arrest warrant through the Swiss process. He was kind of sentenced, if you will, to house arrest, but he owns a chalet in Switzerland and was just hanging out in his house. So he really hasn't had much punishment at all.
No. Yeah, that's insane. Has the U.S. had similar extradition requests denied by countries protecting people accused of sexual assault? I guess, is there any other case that kind of comes to mind that's similar to this at all in our history that's, would be a well-known instance?
It's not like directly on point, but now I think it was Natalie Holiday. It was a woman, I think, in the Dominican Republic who was sexually assaulted and murdered.
It's Natalie Holloway in Aruba is, I think, the case, the Jorn van der Sloot case. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And so he, I think, fled to Brazil where there's not an extradition treaty and was able to live there for a while, and then went to a country where there was, and that's how we were able to bring him here. I'm not intimately familiar with all of the facts of that case. And he certainly wasn't as well heeled or well known. And, I think that plays a massive role that we can't overlook. This was Roman Polanski. And in that period of time, he was a huge name, a mega star, hanging out, as you said, with all the A-listers. And there were folks who were bending over backwards to kind of say, well, maybe this was because of the trauma he experienced as a Holocaust survivor, or maybe it's just cultural. French people are going to do X, Y, or Z. I mean, all pretty pathetic, frankly, excuses. And I also think, the murder of his wife, Sharon Tate, played into that. She was so beloved, and that was such a horrible thing. There were a lot of people suggesting that his trauma caused him to act out in this way, which, now we have a lot of science that will help guide us. So we understand that perpetrators will continue to re-perpetrate unless there's accountability. And it's not just because you have been a victim of a crime or you were victimized and sexually assaulted as a child that you're necessarily going to do these things. There was that belief at the time, though, that people who have been victimized might continue the pattern. That doesn't play out in social science. We understand a lot better, what triggers predators to do this kind of stuff now, but we're still kind of hearing echoes of that in a lot of cases.
Have you been wanting to start a podcast for your law firm? LegalSoft makes it easier than ever by sending people out to you to shoot professional content that we can distribute in long format or short to help you rank better with SEO and maximize your reach on social media. Get started today by swiping up and meet with our professional consultation team to understand how we can add value to your business and get you started today.
Yeah. Why do you think, touching on the A-list, the whole celebrity culture and everything, why do you think so many celebrities did flock to support him? And I know I mentioned, I think Natalie Portman, Emma Thompson, they removed their names from that petition, but a lot of them didn't, so a lot of them are still supporting him. I mean, what is the psychology there or the reasoning? It just, I can't wrap my head around it.
I think that they're afraid of any sort of backlash that he does still have power, kind of the way that Weinstein wielded his power. If you speak out, if you're not silent and complicit, will come after you in some way. I mean, I think it's self-protection and, not wanting to rock the boat.
Yeah, that does make some sense, but it's just so upsetting, on top of everything else. And many people held the victim's mother at fault, whether implicitly or, it just came up a lot, I guess. This, Samantha's mother, for allowing her daughter to participate in these photo shoots. You never want to victim blame, but obviously this was a minor that was under the guardianship of her parents. How do you, as a lawyer and expert in these cases, like, what is your opinion on that component of it?
I think at the time there was a very different understanding of how predators groom and what actually goes on. I think that, her mother was an actress. She may have experienced some casting couch types of situations herself. But I think that no mother, no parent is ever going to intentionally expose their child to this kind of behavior. That's just absolutely unthinkable. And what I have seen time and time again is when this stuff does happen, how much self-blame parents unnecessarily put on themselves because they do take on that ownership. They feel devastated and gutted that they played any role. I've had parents who have, simply drove their kid to an audition when they were little, doing like a junior theater type of, audition or experience, or ballet companies, or little kids doing modeling auditions for, junior clotheslines. And it's horrible. It traumatizes the entire ecosystem of the family. And I'm sure her mother, I don't know her, but I'm sure her mother feels terribly. And it's unfair. It is exactly what you say, victim blaming. It is no one's fault or responsibility to behave differently other than that predators.
I agree. And you brought up a really good point too about things that are just mundane, like second nature, like ballet. I mean, there's so many places that you bring a little kid to that's supposed to be like a healthy outlet for them and them learning something and participating in something fun. And it's like, it's you can't, the sad reality is you cannot protect anyone from everything, it's just, there's so many X factors that are just dark.
Well, and what we know is that people who are going to prey on children go to where the children are.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we can't, keep our kids from engaging in normal things, school, after school sports, ballet, whatever.
Right. Things that are supposed to be healthy outlets. With all the evidence that was there in this case, why do you think these the psychiatrists, their evaluations recommended against prison time here? Was that corruption? Or, I mean, obviously we're speculating, but
Right.
what could be some of the reasons around that?
I think the cultural norms at the time, and probably a little bit of, I don't know if I would use the term corruption, but just kind of a patriarchal, good old boys society. I mean, young girls were viewed, differently than a famous person engaging in a relationship with a young person is fine. I mean, if you look at what David Bowie and Robert Plant were dating the same 14-year-old at the same time during this time frame. I mean, there was so many examples.
I'm reminded because just last month I started watching this. I was a kid. I grew up in New York in the 80s and 90s. And when there's a Peacock show that came out called Bronx Zoo 90 about the 90s Yankees. And there was this player, Mel Hall, who I remember as a kid, whatever. But apparently this whole time when this is a big part of this, it was like a 3-part series. He was like openly dating like a 15-year, this is a 30-something-year-old man, took her to prom, moved in with her family. He's in prison for like 40 years, this guy. But it speaks to the point that you were making that like somehow this was known. He took her to her prom. Like the whole school saw them together. And somehow it was like, how was that okay? It's crazy.
Exactly. I mean, there are all kinds of stories about musicians and comedians. Seinfeld was dating a 17-year-old when he was in his 30s, and that wasn't that long ago, and everybody acted like that was normal.
I know. Yeah, that's come up recently. Recently, again, I saw people, kind of coming back up into the public conversation.
There's I think that when you're talking about people in the prison system, parole officers, probation officers doing these reports, I think that they're influenced a lot by the structure. Mm-hmm. And when you have people who work in the criminal justice system, part of the problem is helping them, or part of the goal is to help them take their lens off of an internal gauge of how bad is this according to you.
Right.
So they're looking at it through the lens of, I have seen the worst, most horrific, most disgusting crimes. Mm-hmm. And here we have an older guy who's famous, got a lot of money. Maybe she was into him. He was a Holocaust survivor. His wife was murdered. He's culturally different. They were a lot more willing to engage in the fiction of all of these excuses than I think they are today, but it's still not perfect. Everyone is still applying their own lens, and they see really horrific things all day, every day.
Yeah, those are interesting perspectives and things that are, I wouldn't automatically think of all of that stuff, but you're right. In terms of like the prison system and just kind of the comparative analysis, right? Whether it's conscious or subconscious. In Polanski's case, when he fled the US, what do you think that tipping point was when he hightailed it out of the US and I don't think he's ever come back. Yeah. So was there sort of like a trigger, or obviously the case was coming down on him, but what were what was happening at that time when he actually left?
I think that there was a lot more out in the public in terms of what the judge was thinking and feeling about the sentencing hearing that was coming up. I can't imagine that the judge himself was making these statements, but right. There were leaks. And I think the big concern was, look, I pled to this because I was going to get time served. And now I'm afraid the judge is going to flip the script on me, and that this could be a lot more serious, and I've got an out and I'm going to take it.
Yeah. He's 90 now. Polanski's 90 years old. Do you think there is still a chance for extradition attempts? Or, what does the outlook look like with him? Is this just, are we sort of past the Rubicon and it's not going to happen here? What is the current sort of legal side of this in terms of going after him?
I wish I could say that his age doesn't matter. He committed a crime. He pled guilty to the crime, and he should have to be sentenced and served, even if they say time served again. But we have to allow our system to actually play out and not make excuses because of age. He wasn't 90 when he did this crime.
Nope.
And so I think there should be accountability. I think it sends a message to other predators.
Yeah, 100%. Micha, thank you so much for joining us here today on this case. I know this is a difficult one to talk about, but it's so interesting. And you are, an expert in this field. Again, Liberty Law, Oakland, California, sexual abuse and assault, employment, civil rights. Micha, tell our audience where they can find you.
You can find me at libertylaw.com, and I'm happy to chat.
Awesome. And Micha, we hope to have you back here on Unshut Cases sooner than later. Please come back, because it was really, really good to kind of get your expertise and your perspective on this.
Absolutely, I will.